Well, hello all. Thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to part two in our three-part series on estate planning with Tiffany O'Connell. My name is Ryan Anderson. I am the outreach manager at Kendal at Home. With me today from the Kendal at Home team is our CEO, Lynn Giacobbe, along with Sue Woytkin, marketing and events coordinator at Kendal at Home. Sue will be helping us manage the behind the scenes stuff, making sure Zoom's running all fine and everything there, as well as answering any questions that you might have throughout our program today. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin on it. If you would like to change the view at any point in the event, up in the top right-hand corner, there's a little view button. You can change that to whatever your preference is. If you want to see more of a speaker, if you want to see more of the presentation, the PowerPoint that Tiffany O'Connell will be sharing, please feel free to do that there. If you have any questions or comments throughout the event, please feel free to either drop those in the Q&A or the chat feature, and we'll be happy to answer those as we go along. There will be a Q&A portion at the very end of our session just to answer those questions that you have throughout there. So we will get to those at the end. And lastly, if you do want to have some subtitles at the bottom of your screen, there is a closed captioning feature. If you press at the bottom of your the Zoom dialog there at the bottom, there's a closed captioning button on the bottom right. Click on that, and if you click on that little caret arrow right there, you can have that top option is going to be hide or show subtitles, where you can see those along the bottom. And then the third option there is going to be a settings feature where you can actually change the size of the subtitles depending on your preference right there. So without further ado, Tiffany O'Connell is here with us today. Tiffany is a attorney out of Natick, Massachusetts. I was told I'm obviously now from Massachusetts. The first time I said Natick, it's Natick there. But Tiffany is out of Natick, Massachusetts. And she's going to be going over how to choose your helpers, how to pick those right people for you to help manage your estate and everything there, and even maybe how to reevaluate if those helpers that you chose 10, 15, 20 years ago are still those right people today. So Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to this session.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you everyone for being in attendance today. So I'm so thrilled to see that this is actually a topic people want to know about, because I do feel that people do need to know about this. This is going to be very much of a working workshop session. So I hope that you have the worksheet that Ryan, I believe, sent out this morning. If not, Ryan, do you have an ability to share it through the chat in case anyone needs it?
Yeah, if anyone has any, if anyone did not receive the email this morning with the worksheet, please feel free to say so in the chat, and Sue and I will be happy to send that along to you shortly.
Second. All right. So Brian, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. They decided to start cutting down trees again. So
Perfect timing, right?
Perfect timing. So I just want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. So what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm going to actually go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to have a PowerPoint I'm going to bring everyone through for this. So with that, I'll share my screen. And Ryan, I know you're going to be paying attention to anyone that needs the worksheet. So let me start this PowerPoint. And what we're going to be focusing on today is we're going to be focusing on how to pick, and you might not have heard people reference it this way, but how to pick your helpers. So there are definitely, there's real legalese names in order to, for an estate plan for who's going to be handling stuff. But you're going to hear me say all the way through helpers, because that's what they are. They're either helping on the financial side, they're helping with kids, or they're helping on the medical side. So I'm going to just be using the word helpers throughout, but we are going to be referencing the particular role and the particular title for that. But just know generically, I'm just going to reference to helpers throughout. So if you've gotten the worksheet before, great. If not, I know Ryan is going to be trying to get it to you. At the very least, you'll get it at the end. And honestly, if you don't have it, just take a piece of paper and I'll be able to guide you through. So even if you don't have the worksheet until afterwards, this will be well worth your time. Like I did before, this is my disclaimer. This is not a how-to, nor is it legal advice. This purpose of this session today is to help you understand the different roles that people play in an estate plan and what you should be thinking about as you're choosing who those folks should be. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So this is workshop number 2 of a 3-part series. So if you have not listened to the first session yet, which is on the key estate planning documents everyone should have, I encourage you after this to listen to that. I know that Kendal has recorded it and they do have it up on a website, and I'm sure that Ryan can get you that information. So we're not going to be diving into what the documents do today. We're going to be diving into who should be helping with those documents. So how to pick these folks. Now that we know what the documents are, let's talk about who the helpers should be. And again, as I mentioned, that's not the legalese term, but it does describe what they do. So a helper can be a person, or it could also be an entity. Oftentimes when we're talking about an entity, we're talking about a trust company or a bank that is serving in the role of the helper. So especially on the financial side, that is something that can be done. And we're going to be talking about that. In most cases, though, it usually is a person who's actually in that role of helper, but just know, especially for the financial, it could be an entity that's handling it. Now, let's start going over the different types. And this is where we're going to start referencing to the worksheet. And again, if you don't have the worksheet, don't worry, because I'll guide you through so that way you too can partake in this. So the first helper we're going to talk about today is what's called the personal representative. Now, that person can also be called an executor. It depends on the state where you are. But what that person is it's the person, and you're going to hear me say person, whether we're saying entity or not. I'm just going to say person for purposes of making it simple, but just know this could be an entity handling this. So the personal representative is appointed by the probate court to handle someone's financial affairs, in this case, upon their passing. And so normally what would happen is hopefully you have a will, or you're going to be getting a will. And in that document, you will actually say who the personal representative should be. You are nominating that person, and the court will generally go with who you're suggesting, unless there's a reason not to. Reason not to might be maybe they're in jail, right? Or maybe they're not living. So there's different reasons why someone won't actually, the court won't allow, but generally the court's going to allow it unless there's a real reason not to. So knowing that, if someone doesn't have a will, then the court will decide who the personal representative would be, and they're going to go based on that state hierarchy of who should serve in that role. So not surprise, surprise, or not surprise, surprise, I would prefer you all to pick who you want versus letting the court have to decide based on that schedule. So therefore having the will is crucial so you can nominate who that person will be. So knowing that, what we're now going to do is we're actually going to start thinking about who that person or entity should be. So in your worksheet, and I'm actually going to read from the worksheet, especially for those that do not have it yet, but there's certain things that I want you all to consider when you're thinking about who that helper, who that personal representative should be. First thing is that helper going to be good in that role? Sometimes that would not be an appropriate role for someone. Maybe it's too cumbersome. Maybe it would be too overwhelming. Maybe they're not good with finances. Maybe they're disorganized. Maybe they're not trustworthy. So there's many different reasons why they wouldn't be good for the role, but I always want you to start there. Would that person be good for this role? Then the next thing is okay, you might say, you know what, this person, they'd be okay in this role, but they maybe don't have the sophistication I would like. But I know they have the common sense to go get help. Now, maybe you don't know anyone who doesn't have that common sense level to go get help when they need to. But as long as that person knows that, hey, if I don't know what I need to do, I'm going to go get the professional help I need, then that person could be okay in that role because they realize that they don't know everything and they're willing to go get the help. You run into problems when you have someone who will not go get help when they need it. And sometimes they end up doing stuff wrong. And sometimes it just stalls out, meaning that they can't figure out what they need to do, but they won't go get the help. So if they won't go get the help, that person is not good for this role. The next thing I want you to consider for this role is, again, would it be too burdensome? If thinking my sister has 5 young children, that might be too burdensome for her to have to take on this role. So think about who you're thinking about. Would it be too burdensome for them? Now, ideally, you're doing this and you're hoping that something's not going to happen for a long, long time. But if you know it's going to be burdensome, even in the future, maybe that person isn't the right role for that. Now, next thing I always want you to consider is, will there be some crazy family dynamics that's going to happen as a result of this choice? And so bottom line is, it's going to be what's right for you and what you want, but I do want you considering all these things as you go through. Um, Oftentimes I'll have clients who will say, you know what, I don't want to choose. So I'm just going to have it be my oldest child, then the next oldest, and then the next oldest. Well, that might be okay. But again, were they appropriate for the role? Would they actually go get help? Would it be too burdensome? The other thing you want to consider, because maybe you might say, you know what, I want it to be 2 of my kids and this third kid, I'm not going to even mention. When that time comes for them to actually have to administer the role, how are those family dynamics going to be if the other one absolutely has no role? There's different things, and this will be for the third workshop. So I'm going to tailor some of this discussion for then. But some of this will come down to essential communications that you're going to have during life in order to help make those family dynamics go smoother. But you always want to think about what kind of family dynamics is going to potentially get out of whack for this, knowing that you're never going to actually know. Now you may say, you know what? Okay, I have who it's going to be, but I actually want it to be multiple people. That is okay if that is what is best for the situation. I always start with the premise, though, that sometimes you can have too many cooks in the kitchen. If there's more than one person, more than 2 people, it can sometimes get a little burdensome as well as stressful because of multiple people having to sign off on things, but it could be the best situation for you. Now, I'm going to talk about this more at the end, but you always want to have a backup. And actually, let me just talk about that now because this is going to be all the way through. Whoever you choose, you want to make sure you have an alternate or a backup behind who you've chosen. Because guess what? You're not going to know if that person can do it at that time. One, it may not be a good time for them. So they might need to take a pass. 2, they might not be able to. They might be incapacitated. They might not be living. And 3, it just situations may have changed. And so you want to be able to have a way that if that person wants to be able to just take a step aside, there will be a next person named. And so on the worksheet, and again, this is more for the people who don't have the worksheet yet, you're going to see that I have a spot for a primary helper role and then an alternate and another alternate. But no, you could go even deeper than that. You can name as many alternates as you want, because if you're like, oh, I'd rather it be this person before this person, well, maybe you want to make sure you're putting it down in the order you want so you can help ensure the appropriate person would be there to take on that role at that time. Now, if you don't have an alternate or two alternates, one, if you don't have two alternates, but at least you have one alternate, at least you have one alternate. If you don't have an alternate because there's just no one that is appropriate, or you know what, you're in a situation where you don't even have a primary helper, this is where you honestly start looking at hiring a professional. It could be an individual professional, which tends to be a CPA or an attorney, or it could be an entity. And this is where we get into the trust companies and the banks and all that come in to serve in this fiduciary role, because it is a fiduciary role. They have a responsibility, whoever it is, whether it is an individual or whether it's an entity, to make sure that they're doing the right thing. So knowing that, I want you to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to give you just a minute to think about who would be appropriate based on your current circumstances. Now, before I give you that minute, though, I do want to say one other thing, is oftentimes, this is what I've seen from clients, is that they'll say, well, you know what, let me go back to my old documents that I did. And let me go back to the old documents and see what I said then. It's not that you can't or you shouldn't. It's just when I'm talking with a client about updating their plan, I want to know what they want now. What they want now could be different from what was in the past, and I don't want the past to influence what is appropriate for them now. So if you can, try not to refer back to who you chose back when, if you did an estate plan years ago. Think about who would be appropriate now. And that way it makes sense for now and going into the foreseeable future and not relying on the past. Final thing, and then I'll give you that 1 minute to actually write things out, is if you're married, oftentimes that primary role will be your spouse, unless there's a reason why that's not appropriate. It could be that it would be too burdensome for them. It could be that your spouse is not in a well enough state to be able to handle that. But oftentimes, if everything is smooth going and everything is fine, oftentimes the spouse will be in that primary role. So with that, I promise to give you a minute to go ahead and put down that primary person, then an alternate, and then if you can, at least one other alternate. All right, so now, knowing that your homework is to actually go and finish the worksheet, so that way you'll have that to go with, we're going to go ahead and talk about the next role. So the next role is someone called a guardian. Now, in my book that you should have a copy of, you'll notice that guardian could apply for a guardian for minor children, and a guardian could also apply for someone who is of majority age, so an adult, but is incapacitated. We're not going to be talking about the adult guardian role. What we're going to be talking about today is the guardian role if you have minor children. And so the idea is, if you do have minor children, or if you're trying to encourage someone to do a will that has minor children, having a will is crucial, because this is where you nominate who should take care of the kids if you are no longer living. Now, knowing that, I know that is a really hard role to choose. And bottom line is, there will never be anyone as good as you for taking care of your children. So knowing that, a lot of people I find will actually not do a will for a long time because they can't figure out who should serve in that role. Maybe it's because they can't figure out anyone, or maybe it's because it's like, oh my gosh, we can't choose among the families. Who would it be? We don't want to hurt feelings. Look, bottom line is it's so crucial for you to actually do your will, nominate who it's going to be, because if, guess what, if you don't and something happens, it's going to be the court trying to figure it out. And we never want to let the court have to be the one who has to try to figure it out. So knowing that, I know it can be hard, but it's best for you to say, okay, if it's not me, then this, and then this. So again, you're going to want to think about, and referring to the spreadsheet, would that person be good in that role? Next thing you want to think about is, and this is so important, will that person, will that helper actually follow what your values are and raise your child in the manner that you would want, right? Because if your value is, when Sally graduates from high school, I want her going backpacking in Europe, but the person that you pick is like, no, Sally is working from the day that she graduates on, and then we'll go on to school. Not that one's right or wrong, it's just different values. So you will want to try to find someone that has values that suit what you are doing. Again, is the role too burdensome? So you want to think about that again. And then again, what kind of crazy family dynamics would happen? And again, I don't want this to prevent you from actually doing it, but just have that in the back of your mind. And then should it be one person? Should it be joint? Thinking about too many cooks in the kitchen. And then of course, I want you to have alternates. And again, if you're married, it's usually your spouse. If you're not married, you normally would put down that child's biological parent, unless there's a real reason for you not to. And then you want to make sure you have alternates. So again, I'll just give you a little less than a minute to go ahead and start thinking about that. And then again, you can complete it afterwards. All right, so now we're going to go on to the next role. So now the next role talks about the power of attorney agent. So as a reminder, the power of attorney agent is the person who is named in your durable power of attorney to step into your shoes to handle something for you, in this case, something financial for you that you've authorized in the document. So knowing that, this power of attorney agent would step into your shoes to handle financial stuff. Again, might be limited or might be everything, but the idea is you're giving the legal authority to this person to do that. So knowing that for this person is a very similar analysis to what you thought about for who should be the personal representative under the will. Both are financial roles. And as such, oftentimes it doesn't have to be the same order, but oftentimes it is the same order, because if they're good in one role, then they should be good in the other role. Now, before I give you the couple of minutes to go ahead and fill that out, I'll just make a couple of comments from what I've heard from clients as they've talked about this, is that sometimes they'll say, you know what, because I have 3 kids, I'm going to have one be the one who takes care of the will, so the personal representative. I'll have one that will be the power of attorney agent for my power of attorney. And then what we're going to talk about very soon is for the healthcare, this person will make the medical decisions. Again, it is fine to do a divide and conquer, again, as long as they're going to be okay in the role. And then for the personal representative and power of attorney, no, those are at 2 different times. For the power of attorney, that would be during your life. Now, it could be immediately or upon a certain event happening, which is usually upon incapacity. But the power of attorney agent will only be able to act during your life during the specified time. For the personal representative under the will, that person would only act once they're appointed by the court upon your passing. So they're actually, because a lot of people think, oh, well, my power of attorney can do handle that upon my passing. No, the power of attorney can only handle that for you during your life, again, during the specified periods that you've designated. So that may or may not go into the factor if you choose different people, but generally, you could do a divide and conquer if you have multiple children and they would all be good in the role, but just know it would be different time periods for it, and it would be very similar tasks. So again, I'll give you just a minute to go ahead and fill out who that primary would be, and then try to get to an alternate, and then if you can, at least one other alternate. And again, more alternates the merrier, because we don't know who's going to be available. So the next one we're going to talk about for the helper roles is for the healthcare directive agent. This is the person that you name in your healthcare directive to say who would be able to make medical decisions for you if you're incapacitated and unable to do so yourself. So knowing that, this is the person, and usually this is not an entity. I haven't seen any entities that want to take on this role. So this would be a person that you would choose. And for this, maybe it's the same order of what you had for the personal representative and power of attorney, or maybe it's different because they're different skills. So knowing that, these are some things I want you to think about as you're thinking about who that healthcare directive agent should be. Again, would they be good in that role? That's always the first thing you're going to ask. Will they follow what your values are and make the type of medical decisions you would have wanted? So if I ever get to the point where I can no longer, if the doctors have come back and said, can't do anything more, and I can't communicate with the doctors, I wouldn't want anything more. But if my husband would be, nope, keep her hooked up forevermore, maybe he wouldn't be the best one as my primary because he's not following what I would have wanted, right? And so making sure you're choosing someone who would follow what you want, as well as make the type of decisions that you would want, is very important. The other thing that I would say here, as you guys are thinking about this, is having the documents, naming who the helpers are, crucial, but also, and again, this ties into part of the third workshop, but it's so important to actually have the conversations with who you've chosen so that they know what you would want, right? And so if I pick my sister as my healthcare agent, I want to make sure she knows what I would want and not want. So having those conversations is crucial. Again, you're going to want to think about, is this role too burdensome for the person? Like, would them having to make those kind of decisions just be too much for the person, and therefore you don't want to put that burden on them? Again, you'd be surprised at the family dynamics that happen as a result of how folks are chosen. And then again, should it be one person? Should it be multiple? And of course, as always, we want you to have alternates. So again, I'm going to give you a minute to think about who the primary should be, and then again, alternates. And again, if you're married and everyone is well, oftentimes that first person is your spouse. And just before we go to the final role, please feel free, post in the chat box or the question and answer section. We will have time for questions. Of course, I'll be only able to speak generally, but I can certainly help you if you're struggling on any of these decisions. So the final role that we're going to talk about is the trustee if you have a trust. And again, this workshop is not to talk about what a trust is, but if you have a trust, then you need to have a trustee. The trustee is the person in your trust who's responsible for following what the instructions are that were laid out in the trust, providing for whoever the named beneficiaries are in the trust, and taking care of and being responsible for anything that the trust owns or anything that the trust receives during your life or upon your passing. So knowing this, again, is a very similar analysis to what you thought about for the personal representative as well as for the power of attorney agent, because again, those are financial roles and the trustee is a financial role. So you want to be thinking about, again, will they be good in that role? Will they get help if they need it? Will this be too burdensome for them? Because oftentimes the trustee has a lot of stuff they need to be handling for both taking care of the assets, making sure tax returns are prepared, taking care of the beneficiaries, making sure that they're following what the instructions are. So it is definitely not a light, easy role. What kind of family dynamics again will happen? And again, should it be one person, then another, or is this an entity role? Because you know what, this would be too burdensome, or I don't have anyone appropriate. So oftentimes with a trust, especially if you don't have someone who would be really appropriate to step into that role, this is oftentimes where you see the bank or a trust company step in. Again, this doesn't have to happen, especially if you have a good bench of individuals who could step up and would be great in the role, but just know that it's not uncommon to see a bank or a trust company step in. Now, if you have a revocable trust with an R, so meaning that you keep full control of it during your life, you were normally the primary trustee. If you're married, it may be you and your spouse, or it might just be you for your own trust. But then you're really going to want to think about alternates. If you can't be taking care of it, or if it's an irrevocable trust and you and your spouse can't be the trustee, who would it be? And so again, if it's a revocable trust, it's likely going to be you and or your spouse first. Then it's oftentimes your spouse second. If you can't take care of things with a revocable trust, again, as long as the spouse is fine and well. But then who is it after? And if you don't have a spouse, who is it after? And again, try to get it down one more level beyond that. So again, on the worksheet, you'll see primary, then you'll see an alternate line, and then you'll see another alternate line. Doesn't mean you can't keep on going down to more alternates, but I'd at least like to see you get those filled out. And again, I'll just give you a minute to be thinking about that. So now, before we go to question and answers, I know I've been harping on this all the way through so far, but it is so important to name successor helpers because we just don't know who's going to be available. And so again, figure out who that primary is, then come up with an alternate, and then if possible, come up with alternates behind that. Because again, it's better for you to have the bench of who you would want than for a court to ever have to figure it out. So before we go to question and answers, homework, because I love giving homework. I want you reading from my book, chapter 2, section 2.7. That goes over everything that we just talked about here. And to the extent that you still need help with figuring out who those helpers would be, that will help. And then of course, I encourage you, please sit down with an estate planning attorney and they can help you flesh that out further. So with that, Ryan, let's go to question and answers.
Absolutely. And thank you for walking through all those things. I think people hear I mean, me personally, at least too, you hear all these terms thrown around and you're just like, what does this even mean? Like you're hearing executor thrown around, you're hearing trustee, like it means different things in different contexts. So thank you for walking through that all. And people, please feel free to throw things in the chat or the Q&A if you have questions that you would like answered. Questions that come to my mind off the bat: is one more important than the other, or because they serve all different purposes, are all equally important in your opinion?
Yeah, so in my opinion, they're all equally important. They're all equally important because they have different purposes, right? And you know, everyone should have a will, everyone should have a power of attorney, everyone should have a healthcare directive. So knowing that, those roles are equally important, because it's just, is someone serving during your life to make medical decisions, or are they serving upon your passing and therefore the personal representative, or are they handling financial stuff for you during your life if you can't? It's equally important because it's just whatever's happening at that time. And then if a trust is appropriate for you, it's the same deal. That's handling probably a lot of your assets, right? So every role is equally important. It's just different roles.
Okay. And someone actually put in the chat here, do you recommend that should be a different person in each role? Can you double dip and use the same person for various roles? What do you see people doing? What do you recommend on that? Obviously, successor plays a role too, but
yeah, so no, good question. And so one of the things that I'm gonna, and not knowing who is actually listening in today or going to be listening to this afterwards, this is talking about the guardian, so therefore for minor children. I always do start off saying to my clients that I want you starting with the premise that sometimes the person taking care of your child should not also be holding the money. You start with that premise for guardian, right? Because one, it could be too burdensome, but also sometimes that could give a little bit of a conflict. So knowing that, you start with that premise for guardian, and then you rule it in or rule it out based on your circumstances. And so I know that for my particular circumstances, my sister would actually be fine in both roles, and I would want her in both roles. But that's my particular circumstances. But if I also had, so I have one sister. So, but if I also had a brother, or I might want the brother taking care of the kids and my sister taking care of the finances, because you know what, they get along. In my scenario, right? I don't have a brother, but in my scenario, they get along and they'd work well together. Or maybe it's my brother-in-law, but I know they would work well together, right? So that's for guardian. But for the other, for personal representative, for power of attorney for financial, and for a trustee or successor trustee, those are all financial roles. So it is very common to say who I'm naming would be the most appropriate person in all those roles. Because it's just, what hat do they happen to be wearing, right? But for medical, that might be someone very different, because you know what, maybe the person who's taking care of my finances wouldn't be the best one making medical decisions, just because they're not wired that way. But maybe they are. And maybe then it's fine to have it the same all the way through. So it's just something you just kind of want to walk through. But I don't see a problem having the same order of helpers, especially for a personal representative, a power of attorney agent, or a trustee.
So you mentioned in your example of your sister and your fake brother or brother-in-law in this case on it, like, you knowing that they'd be able to work together. Is that something you should take into consideration when choosing your helpers? Is, okay, I would love this person and this person to be in these two roles, but they butt heads. They are not well to converse together. If I was incapacitated, this would not end well. Is that something that should be taken into consideration?
You bet. So that goes to the family dynamics, right? And so it's like, ooh, wait a minute. By doing that, I'm really setting up a likely friction to happen.
Yeah.
And so that could therefore say, you know what, then that might not be the best people to be doing it because of that very likely friction that would happen.
Well, it would be nice to look at everything in a vacuum and say, this is the best person for here, this is that. There's a lot of other factors that go into it when choosing your helpers on it. Things such as like things that I've heard too is like proximity to it.
Yeah.
Someone is across the country and now has to come back to kind of manage some things. 20 years ago, it was a great person, but it was me and my friends, we were all around the table, we said we're going to be each other's executors or healthcare powers of attorney. We forgot that we're going to age at the same time. Now we're both 85 and they're not in a strong position to take care of me on that or make those decisions. So different things like that I've heard. And so it's interesting seeing, well, as much as we would love to take in a vacuum, you have to look at a larger picture.
Exactly. And Ryan, there were many things I appreciate about that, but one thing that really stuck in my mind as you were talking about that is one of the reasons why I don't want people referring to their old documents when they're looking to update their current documents, because the idea is what makes sense now.
Mm-hmm.
What made sense then made sense then. Doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
it's going to make sense now. And so that's a really important factor. The other thing that I just want to point out, and thank you again for mentioning this, is if someone is not local,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't mean that you shouldn't choose them,
Mm-hmm.
but it does add a level of complexity to it, right? Because they're not right there. So that kind of goes to that question, is it too burdensome? Now, in today's world, and I can't even imagine what we're going to be 5-10 years down the road from here, especially for the financial role,
Mm-hmm.
that may be okay to not have someone local, especially if you have things organized, right? If you don't have things organized and everything is all over the place, well, yeah, that person's going to have a nightmare trying to figure things out. So please, people, keep things organized. Right? Keep it in a binder, let people know where you keep that information and make sure they can get access to it when they need to. But for the financial role, after that initial maybe seeing what's in the house, then it's really, I mean, they can pick up the phone, they can do a video conference, they can sign online. So always go with who is the best person or potentially entity, right? You start there. And if you can have someone that is equally suited for the role, that's local versus not local, well, then yeah, maybe pick the local person. But if it's like, no, the best person is that person who's over on the other side of the coast, go with the best person. For healthcare, though, that one, if possible, you probably do want to get someone local, or at least get someone local in the alternate chain, just because that's more immediate, right? They need to be able to make the medical decisions, and it might be harder for them to make it if they're in Timbuktu.
Yeah. Okay. Especially when you can't, medical usually, like being able to actually see the person who's incapacitated at that time, fully grasping the situation. Doctors, nurses, whoever, relaying that in care coordinators with Kendal at home, relaying that information. Great, but to be able to see it with your own eyes, witness everything, it adds another level to it. That
correct. It really does, and it just gives better advocacy for the person because they're able to actually be there and see what needs to happen.
And that's the name of the game, is advocacy to it. It's you're not dictating something. You're trying to say this is what they want to do. Let's get those desires out there. Even though they're incapacitated, this is what they would be saying at those times.
Correct.
We have a question come through. You had mentioned your book multiple times on it, which so if you would like, please believe it's the links on our page on that. If you would like to get a copy of the book, Tiffany has been very gracious in providing the copy free of charge to anyone attending these sessions. So you do need to put in a credit card, even though it is free of charge. If you are not comfortable with that, please reach out to either Sue or I on that, and we'd be more than happy to take that care of it for you and get that copy shipped out to you as soon as possible. Hopefully that will get there in time before our third session here in 2 weeks. So you can have it, you can read it through and have a little bit more insight around there for the next session. So another question just rolled through here. Which roles are better assigned to persons versus which ones should be assigned to entities? Is it more of just your own personal situation? What's your opinion on that if you were going through this now?
Yeah, so for that, I've yet to see an entity that wants to take on the healthcare role.
Okay.
Right? So that would definitely be an individual in pretty much most circumstances. So you definitely, in your healthcare directive, you want to be naming an individual on that one. For the other roles, it is possible to have an entity doing, whether it's a personal representative or a power of attorney agent or trustee. I'd say the most common that I see, though, is that an entity would step in to be the successor trustee of a trust.
Okay.
That's probably the most common. And then it just depends on someone's complexity, someone's personal situation, someone's asset level as to whether the entity would normally also be the power of attorney and the personal representative too. Sometimes some people will just say, no, just name this trust company for the successor trustee, and then I'm fine naming this friend or family member for power of attorney or personal representative. So it does come down to your particular circumstances, but I'd say the most common that I see is definitely for the trust.
Okay. Which makes sense when you're dealing with finances, estates, and things like that. That point might be larger to it versus the healthcare. That gets very personal, and I don't know what entity would be like, yes, we're going to take care of this on that and make the right decision on it, because it becomes a little bit more personal. There's emotions that get thrown through there.
Exactly.
Okay. Sounds good. What is the, as you were talking, you were mentioning all these things, like what mistake do you see made where something happens and you're like, if only they would have done this, or you have the second thoughts to it. Either common mistake, largest ones you see people making in your experience.
Yeah, I say the most common mistake that I see is not naming alternates.
Mhm.
And that's why I was harping on it so much, because again, we don't know who's going to be available. And so really having that bench of alternates, I think the biggest mistake that I see is people not doing that. And
Mhm.
that should be for every legal document, whether it's the will or the power of attorney or the healthcare directive or the trust. Having those alternates on every single one in the estate plan is crucial. So I'd say that's the most common.
Uh-huh.
The other one that I would see is the most common is picking someone who's not good for the role. Just saying, you know what, I have one child, and so they're going to be the one handling it. And that child is just too burdensome. Right. And so therefore it's like, boy, I wish they had really chosen a bank or trust company for this one.
Mhm.
And so just not really taking that time to analyze and say, kind of playing devil's advocate and saying, is this rule okay for this person? Because you know what? There's no shame in saying it's not,
Mhm.
because it just is, it's a job, it's a fiduciary role. And I'm speaking about the legal, the financial ones, the will, the power of attorney, and the trust. And it's just really take that time to say, is that person going to be good in that role? And if I'm choosing more than one person, how are those dynamics?
Absolutely. And just because someone is kin to you and family or loved one, doesn't necessarily make them the right person in that role to it. You have to look at those family dynamics. You have to look at situations. Don't be afraid to step outside that bubble and go to someone who you know is going to make the right decisions. I've heard of people before with healthcare power of attorney saying, my family's going to be too emotional on that. I want the cord pulled. Like, I don't want to go through that. I'm picking my attorney because I know the attorney is emotionally detached from the situation and will actually carry out my wish, versus my family and loved ones might not actually want to make that emotional call to do what I want done. So it becomes a very touchy situation on some of those things where you have to look at the larger image of everything.
Yeah, exactly. And really by choosing that person and giving them that burden, it's not helping them, right? It's just made their life worse. And so, but this is often times where we'll see someone go beyond the family
Mhm,
and we'll choose like a friend,
mhm,
or, if it comes down to it, their attorney. Now, I've only had to do that once.
mhm,
I hope to not have to do it very many times, but because that's a big burden. But
mhm,
that being the case, sometimes that's the only choice.
mhm,
But at least, even if you feel that I really don't have someone, there always is someone,
mhm,
right? And so therefore, don't let not being able to figure it out today or even tomorrow
mhm.
prevent you from actually getting the estate plan done. You'd be amazed that just sitting down, talking with your attorney can help flush out the pros and cons to what you're thinking about. And so, any attorney worth their salt should be a real counselor on this
Mhm,
and not make the decision for you, but
mhm.
should actually help you walk through the pros and cons to what you're thinking about.
Don't let perfection get in the way of progress.
Thank you. Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, Tiffany, thank you so much for answering all these questions. If there's any other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or chat right here as we're wrapping up. We do have the upcoming events here coming up. Let me just throw this up on the screen here. Let me, where is this now? Oh, thought I had that. Where is this now? One second here. Working with multiple screens and it's throwing things off. There we go. Okay, so up next, we do have a couple events here with Kendal at Home. Tuesday, March 22nd at 10:30 a.m. we have a staying at home with Kendal at Home. It's going to be a virtual informational seminar designed for potential members and their loved ones interested in learning more about Kendal at Home. So if you're interested in becoming a potential member, or if you know friends or family who you think should be looking at Kendal at Home as a potential option to help them actualize their goals as they age, please feel free to invite them to this virtual event here. Next up, Thursday, March 24th. So that's 2 weeks from today, 11 a.m. again. We have part 3 in our 3-part seminar with Tiffany O'Connell. Tiffany, what's the subject matter for this 3rd session?
Yeah, so for this 3rd session, I'm really excited about this one too, is because this is going to start getting to those essential conversations. Because again, having the documents, knowing who's going to be taking care of things,
Mhm.
need that. But also important is having those conversations with your loved ones, with the folks that are going to be helping, to make sure everyone's on the same page and knows what needs to happen while the waters are calm and not when crisis hits.
Perfect. So we're very much looking forward to that one there. Again, if you would like to sign up for that one, please feel free. That's on our courses and seminars page on our website. And please feel free to invite anyone to that as well. And then the last one we have coming up to round out March here on Tuesday, March 29th at 2 p.m. We're going to have Professor Erin O'Brien from UMass Boston joining us. Erin is a professor of political science at UMass Boston, and she's going to be walking through talking about Massachusetts' record on electing women and women in politics in Massachusetts there. Especially for Women's History Month here, talking about that important subject there to round out March. So please feel free to sign up for any of these sessions with us. That's going to be on our courses and seminars page. That's in the top right-hand corner of our website. All are welcome to that. And as always, we do thank Friends Foundation for the Aging for sponsoring our events to allow us to put on these programs to provide this fantastic information, like you heard today from Tiffany O'Connell on estate planning, and bring that to the larger general public. So please feel free to invite anyone to those. This has been recorded and it will be put onto our Kendal at Home YouTube channel. So if you want to revisit any of this information, if you want to pass it along to someone who would benefit from this that was not able to attend, this should be up by early next week, Monday, Tuesday, somewhere in there on our Kendal at Home YouTube channel. So please feel free to touch on that. There was just one thing in the chat on it.
Yeah, and Brian, I think I can answer that for Bruce, who put that in there. Bruce brings up a very interesting point where he ran into a situation that the person that was listed, if I'm reading this right, before him is no longer living, and it just kind of caused havoc. And yeah, because there's additional paperwork that needs to happen. You gotta get a copy of death certificate, and so it can make it more difficult. So Bruce, thank you for the plug to say that having an estate plan is crucial, but keeping it updated and keeping it relevant is just as crucial. So therefore, as people are no longer appropriate in the role, it is good to freshen up those documents so that way someone doesn't have to go through that extra legwork.
Now, is that like an every 5 years thing? Is that an every 2 years? How often do you recommend you revisit your documents?
Yeah, so we say every 3 to 5 years. It should be dusted off, taken a look at, check in with your attorney, say, does this still make sense? Especially, for my circumstances, for what the laws currently are, should any changes happen? Outside of that, it should be based on life circumstances. If there's any births, deaths, you've moved, there's a significant change in assets, those will trigger a review much sooner. And you will see in the book that I keep referencing that there is a chapter that does talk about those life circumstances that would trigger the type of review. So I definitely encourage, if you have the book, take a look for the life circumstances section. If you don't have the book, I know that Kendal is going to be helping you be able to get it, and then you'll be able to take a look.
Absolutely. And yep, again, please feel free to email either Sue or I and reach out in that case if you would like a copy of the book and have not been able to get a copy of it yet. So I'm not seeing any more questions or comments on it. So Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for walking us through all this information. And we're very much looking forward to having you back here in 2 weeks on March 24th, 11 a.m. again for the last in our 3-part session with you.
Looking forward to seeing everyone then.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining today. Looking forward to seeing you all at future events that we have, and have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Ryan.